Our next section is Gestational Diabetes Mellitus Syndrome Symposium, and to chair the session, let me invite Dr. Ajit Kumar sir, Dr. Deepa ma'am, and Dr. Vivek Krishnan.
Thank you, Dr. Shabir. Once again, we'll move with the presentations because we are running short of time. I think next is a symposium, the Gestational Diabetes Mellitus Symposium. I think it is a very important topic in day-to-day practice because the women and diabetes issues are gaining more significance in our day-to-day practice. We have, I think, 5 to 6 topics will be discussed in this symposium. The first topic will be presented by Dr. Danya G. Krishnan. I think she is alumnus of Trivandrum Medical College. I think she'll be presenting a topic on preparing a woman with diabetes in pregnancy. It is a very, very difficult scenario. The patient will have stress, the consultant, the doctor will have some issues because maternal complications, the high chance of maternal complications and perinatal complications are also there. So how you can prepare a woman with diabetes in pregnancy, it's a very important topic. For that, I invite Dr. Danya G. Krishnan. She is currently working as a junior consultant gynecologist in Women and Children Hospital, Tekkal, Trivandrum. Over to Dr. Danya.
Thanks, Dr. Ajit Kumar, for that introduction. And let me thank Dr. Shabir for giving me this wonderful opportunity. So the topic assigned to me is preparing a woman with diabetes in pregnancy. First, let us go into the definitions. Gestational diabetes is any degree of glucose intolerance with onset or recognition during pregnancy. Then, what is pre-gestational diabetes? And it is diagnosed when the woman has diabetes before pregnancy. So the magnitude of the problem: worldwide, 1 in 10 pregnancies are affected by diabetes mellitus, and out of which 90% of it is GDM. In UK, almost 5% of pregnancies are complicated by diabetes, 87.5% GDM, 7.5% type 1, and 5% having type 2 diabetes. In India, 10 to 14.3% GDM complicates pregnancy. Then, before we counsel the woman regarding how to prepare for her pregnancy, we should know the risk. We should explain to her the risk because of the diabetes, and she has an increased risk of cesarean section. The risk for preeclampsia increases by about 2 to 4 times, and there is a risk for polyhydramnios, preterm labor, PPH, temporary worsening of renal function, progression of the retinopathy. Then there is increased incidence of infection, severe hypoglycemia, decay, and in future pregnancies, she can have recurrent GDM pregnancies and risk of developing type 2 diabetes mellitus. And what are the complications the infants can have? Earlier, in the early part of pregnancy, they can go in for spontaneous abortions. Stillbirths can occur in 10 to 30% of pregnancies. Congenital malformations can occur like neural tube defects, cardiac defects, caudal regression syndrome, even though rare, can occur. Then macrosomia can occur, visceromegaly, respiratory distress syndrome, asphyxia, birth injury like shoulder dystocia, Erb's palsy, diaphragmatic paralysis, and facial paralysis can occur. Then in the neonates, there can be hypoglycemia, hypocalcemia, and magnesium deficiency, which can present as apneic episodes and fits. Polycythemia can occur, which can result in hyperbilirubinemia and jaundice, which may need partial oxygen transfusion. All these we should know to explain to the women. Now, what do you do in a pre-pregnancy counseling? You are assessing the suitability for pregnancy. You are looking for complications of diabetes and evaluating and treating complications prior to the onset of pregnancy. And you are achieving optimal control prior to and during very early pregnancy. And you're providing an opportunity for pre-pregnancy advice and follow-up supplements. Now, the counseling should include diet, body weight, and exercise. You should explain to them that the risk of hypoglycemia is more, and how nausea and vomiting of pregnancy can affect blood glucose control. And there is a chance for lag for gestational baby leading to birth trauma, induction of labor, and cesarean section. And you have to stress upon the assessment of diabetic retinopathy and nephropathy before and during pregnancy. And then you have to stress upon the need for adequate blood glucose control even before pregnancy. And she should be told that there can be temporary health problems in the baby during the neonatal period, and the baby may require admission to the neonatal unit. And in the long term, baby can develop obesity and a diabetes. Now, the pregnancies, all women with diabetes, they should have a planned pregnancy, and the choice of contraception should be personal depending upon the medical eligibility criteria. They can use oral contraceptives if there is no standard contraindication according to the medical eligibility criteria. And you have to explain that the risk is proportional to the duration of diabetes mellitus. More the duration, more the risk. Contraception should be continued till the ideal blood glucose control is achieved, and that is monitored using the HbA1c. And she should be told that we should review frequently the blood glucose targets, the glucose monitoring, diabetes medicines, including insulin regimens, and the drugs which are used for diabetic complications before and during pregnancy. And also she may need frequent visits, that is more than a normal antenatal woman, maybe once in a week or once in 2 weeks. And you should give diet and dietary supplements, and you should stress upon the ideal body weight. And when we're giving dietary advice, it should be individualized. We should take into consideration the risk of hypoglycemia. If the BMI is about 27 kilogram per meter square, you should advise on how to lose weight. And folic acid should be ideally given 3 months prior to conception and should be continued until 12 weeks of gestation, and that's to reduce the risk of having a baby with neural tube defect. And the weight reduction, you should advise that severe calorie restriction should not be done. Like 50% reduction in weight, it can lead to ketosis and impaired fetal brain development. And you can have a moderate calorie restriction like 1,600 to 1,800 kilocalories per day, or 33% reduction in weight. And what are the target blood glucose and HbA1c levels in the preconception? It's like in the type 1 diabetes range. You should keep the fasting plasma glucose level between 5 to 7 millimoles per liter on waking, and at all other before meals, it should be 4 to 7 millimoles per liter. And the target HbA1c, what we say is 48 millimoles per mole, that is 6.5%. Anything above 86 millimoles per mole, you should advise strongly against getting pregnant. So you should advise her to continue contraception till the HbA1c, ideal HbA1c is achieved. Now, the diabetic medications in pregnancy, you can use metformin as an adjunct or alternative to insulin. All other OHs should be discontinued before pregnancy, and insulin should be substituted. Rapid acting insulins, the studies say that there is no risk to the infants, to the fetus. Sorry. Now you can use isophene insulin as a first choice for long-acting insulin during pregnancy. Then she may be on other medications like ACE inhibitors and angiotensin II receptor antagonists, which are used for preventing the complications. As soon as or when she is planning for pregnancy itself, all these medications should be stopped, and statins should also be discontinued. And from the adolescent period, they may be having diabetes. So even from the adolescent period, you have to train them and prepare them, and you have to give information regarding proper blood glucose control from the adolescence itself. And now the retinal assessment in the preconception period, you have to offer retinal assessment to women with diabetes seeking preconception care, the first appointment, unless it has been done in the last 6 months, because retinopathy can get worsened. If she's having already retinopathy, it can get worsened during pregnancy. And the retinal assessment is done by digital imaging with mydriasis using tropicamide. And those women, you have to advise against rapid optimization of glucose control until the retinal assessment is done, because that can worsen the retinopathy. Then renal assessment of a woman with diabetes, a renal assessment including a measure of albuminuria before discontinuing the contraception. Now you have to refer to a nephrologist may be needed if the creatinine is abnormal, like 120 micromoles per liter or more, or when the urinary albumin or by creatinine ratio is greater than 30 milligram per more than 30 milligram per millimole, or the estimated GFR is less than 45 ml per minute. Now, she should have her thyroid functions assessed, because uncontrolled hypothyroidism can result in decreased fertility, increased risk of spontaneous abortion, and increased risk of impaired fetal brain development. I can go for a serum TSH and thyroid peroxidase antibodies checking. And the BP should be in the normal range. That is, it should be ideally less than 130/80, because preconception uncontrolled hypertension can increase the risk of adverse outcomes. So finally, to conclude, aim to empower women with diabetes to have a positive experience of pregnancy and childbirth by providing information, advice, and support that will help to reduce the risk of adverse pregnancy outcomes for mother and baby. And also explain to women with diabetes who are planning to become pregnant that establishing a good blood glucose control before conception and continuing this throughout pregnancy will reduce the risk of miscarriage, congenital malformation, birth, and neonatal death. It is important to explain that risk can be reduced but not eliminated. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Danya. I think you was on time. That's a great achievement. I think if anybody has got any question, I think she'll be ready to
I was rushing.
clarify. The next topic, I think, next is next topic will be presented by Dr. Preetha. It's about the gestational diabetes mellitus and the diagnostic dilemma. Preetha is an alumni of Trivandrum Medical College. She is currently working as senior consultant gynecologist and at Mediterranean Hospital in Tirunelveli. She is a specialized in infertility evaluation and management of infertile patients. And she did her MS from Kasturba Medical College, Mangalore. I think she did her fellowship in minimal access surgery also. A great practitioner. And my close friend's wife also, Dr. Preetha. It's over to you.
So respected chairs, seniors, and dear friends and colleagues, Dr. Shabir and the Diabetes Today 2020 team for giving me this opportunity. And I have been given the topic gestational diabetes mellitus diagnostic dilemma. So why this dilemma? Because despite decades of research and debate, okay, I'll start. Actually, the classification by RIBAS already dealt by Dr. Danya. So I'll just go to the, definition and classification has already been dealt by Dr. Danya. So gestational diabetes mellitus, it can be either de novo pregnancy induced, some are type 2, that's 35 to 40% type 2 diabetes, and 10% have antibodies. So our dilemma lies mainly in the screening and diagnosis. So the timeline for major criteria and trials involving gestational diabetes starts from WHO criteria to Australian carbohydrate intolerance study to DIPSI to IAD-PSG to ADA. The recent consensus have shifted towards accepting ADA criteria, which is a two-step study, two-step test as the most useful for diagnosing gestational diabetes mellitus. However, in the community health centers, pregnant women are reluctant to undergo ADA procedure for two reasons. The first one is the number of blood samples drawn are many. Second, after this was screened for diabetes procedure. And no consensus among international bodies whether this gestation is and whether the use or selective is most effective. The best way would be to develop a definitive test, research preparation, and digital time to perform without requiring imposition of screening test, and which could be applied to the population. And in countries like India with a high diabetes, universal screening would be more appropriate. Like the time, so many guidelines have already come from WHO 1999 criteria, which the WHO dropped in 2013, and they accepted the IAD-PSG criteria. The IAD-PSG guidelines, they recommend performing the test at 24 to 28 weeks period of gestation. The 75 gram 2-hour OGTT is used, and the GDM is diagnosed if any one values exceeds this threshold, that is fasting more than or equal to 92, 1 hour more than or equal to 180, and 2 hours more than or equal to 153. We should know a brief history in the Indian, because some of the Indian pioneers have recommended some guidelines which have even come in the FIGO. In India, the first fetal-placental maternal unit was started at the Institute of Obs and Gynec Maternity Center, ECMO, by Professor Moses, Professor Phillips, and Professor Shea. Is much named in the figure also. In 1985, they organized the first international colloquium on diabetes in pregnancy in Chennai, followed by the formation of DIPSI in 2004. So what's the Indian scenario? Government of India released guidelines in 2014 to address the high prevalence of GDM in India. The present guidelines by the Maternal Health and Family Welfare Government of India, published in February 2018, has been prepared based on the recommendation of experts and available international practices. They recommend using a 75-gram glucose through oral glucose test, irrespective of the level, with a threshold value of 2-hour blood sugar of than 140 milligram per deciliter. So they accepted DIPSI guidelines. Whom and screen. They give 75-gram glucose with single plasma glucose value at 2 hours. It's a universal screening. It's not a high risk or low risk screening. It's a universal screening with more than or equal to 140 milligram per liter considered GDM. More than equal to 120 milligram per deciliter is considered gestational glucose intolerance, and more than 200 milligram per deciliter is considered diabetes. If the first screen is negative, then we have to repeat at 24 to 28 weeks and then at 32 to 34 weeks. So why in India separate guidelines? Indian females have 11-fold increased risk of GDM than Caucasians. The prevalence, particularly in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, is around 16.55%. Universal screening detects more number of GDM, and a single measurement is ideal because it's more economically feasible and more patient compliance. First to be done if antenatal contact as early as possible in the pregnancy. There should be at least 4 weeks gap between the two tests. The test is to be conducted for all the pregnant women, even if she comes late in pregnancy for ANC at the time of first contact. Only 1/3 of GDM positive women are detected during first trimester. So if it could not be done during this time, then it should be repeated at 24 weeks period of gestation. And if she presents beyond 28 weeks period of gestation, the first point of contact, we have to do the GCT. So what's the methodology and test for diagnosis? 75-gram glucose is to be given orally. Approximately 300 ml of water, whether the pregnant woman comes in fasting or non-fasting state, irrespective of the last meal. The intake of the solution in 5 to 10 minutes. A plasma standardized glucometer analyzer or not analyzer should be used to evaluate the blood sugar 2 hours after the oral glucose load. As it is a hyperosmolar solution, it is difficult to tolerate. So if the vomiting occurs within 30 minutes, particularly in the first trimester of oral glucose intake, the test has to be repeated the next day. If vomiting occurs after 30 minutes, the test continues. So in the pregnant woman, test for GDM at the first antenatal visit by 75-gram glucose, followed by 2-hour blood sugar value. If it is positive, consider as GDM. If it is negative, repeat the test at 24 to 28 weeks. If it is positive, consider as GDM. If it is negative, continue the test at 32 to 34 weeks and see the value. Everywhere there is a controversy. Even though we accepted the DIPSI guidelines, one recent study by which it says that diagnosis of GDM by DIPSI criteria leaves 22.36% undiagnosed, which may easily be detected IID PSG criteria. And again, a recent Sri Lankan study showed that a non-fasting test will miss as many as 60% of true GDM. We have to take the message like the convenience of performing DIPSI test is its chief advantage. The National Guideline for Diagnosis and Management of Gestational Diabetes in India endorses a single-step test for diagnosis GDM using a 75-gram glucose through oral glucose tolerance test, irrespective of the last meal, with a threshold value of 2-hour blood sugar more than 140 milligram per deciliter. Guidelines advocate for universal screening for all pregnant women at first antenatal contact. If test is negative, the second test should be done at 24 to 28 weeks period of gestation. Thank you for the patient hearing, and stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you, Preeta, for the wonderful presentation. I think the there was initial few technical issues. Okay, it's not a problem. I think we'll move
Sorry
on.
for the same.
No issues. We'll move on with the symposium. I think next topic will be antenatal care and glycemic monitoring in pregnancy. I think the topic will be discussed by Dr. Sukesh RS. I think, can I get his introduction slide, please? Dr. Sukesh is alumni of Trivandrum Medical College. I think he's currently working as a consultant, senior consultant physician and diabetologist in PRS Hospital, Trivandrum. He's a regular speaker in many regional and national forums, and he's an excellent orator. He's a poet and my close friend, and he has got many publications to his credit. I think Sukesh is an apt person to discuss about the antenatal care and glycemic monitoring in pregnancy. Over to you, Sukesh.
Thank you, Dr. Ajit Kumar, for the nice words, and thank you, Dr. Sabir Rashid, for inviting me as a faculty again for another DIBE conference. So my topic for today is antenatal care and glycemic monitoring in pregnancy. So diabetes mellitus, we know, is associated with maternal morbidity and mortality. Actually, before insulin was discovered in 1921, these diabetic women rarely reach the reproductive age or even survive pregnancy. In fact, pregnancy termination was routinely recommended for those with diabetes because of the high mortality rates. Around 87% of pregnancies are complicated by diabetes are estimated to be due to GDM. And nowadays, even type 1 diabetes in pregnancy is also increasing. So diabetes is one of the most important medical disease complicating pregnancy, and the risk starts even at maternal glucose level below those traditionally considered as diagnostic of GDM. Actually, this poses a serious health consequence for both the mother and the baby, which has been discussed in the earlier slides. Women diagnosed with GDM are at increased risk of future diabetes, predominantly type 2 diabetes, and also their children. GDM offers an important opportunity for the development, testing, and implementation of clinical strategies for diabetes prevention. Therefore, a timely action is necessary to control the diabetic state in pregnancy. So this chart I'm just skipping because this has been already discussed earlier. The prevalence of GDM in India varied from 3 to around 21% in different parts of the country, and the urban areas are more prevalent than the rural areas. For a given population and ethnicity, the prevalence of GDM corresponds to the prevalence of impaired glucose tolerance in non-pregnant adults within that given population. Universal screening for GDM in all pregnant women is recommended to improve outcomes in those women. It is recommended that the GDM screening should be performed at 16 weeks of pregnancy and followed up with a second screening between around 24 to 26 weeks and third after 30 weeks of pregnancy. So as a pregnant woman walks into the antenatal clinic in the fasting or non-fasting state, these women should be given a 75-gram oral glucose load, and at 2 hours a venous sampling should be done. There are so many criteria proposed by the ADA, ACOG, NICE, and even DIPSI. ADA guidelines recommend screening as early as possible, even at around 16 weeks. Repeat the screening during the third trimester is actually suggested by DIPSI guidelines between 32 to 34 weeks of pregnancy. ADA and NICE recommend a 75-gram and 100-gram oral glucose tolerance test, while ACOG recommend a two-step, that is, first you give a 50-gram followed by a 100-gram OGDT. The Australasian study again recommends a screening with a 50-gram or a 75-gram oral glucose challenge test, irrespective of the meal intake. Now, fasting glucose and the postprandial peak level around 90 and 120 milligram per deciliter is actually the recommended target in a lady with diabetes in pregnancy. Actually, the titration is the ideal way is to do a 7-point monitoring, but it's very cumbersome because 3 before and 3 after each meal and 1 in the middle of the night around 3 a.m. is very difficult. So to compromise, 1 fasting and 3 levels each after breakfast, lunch and dinner at least twice a week is more acceptable. So this is an easy thing to follow up your patients. 2 hour plasma glucose more than 1 140 milligram per deciliter, just like an impaired glucose tolerance in a normal subject, should be diagnosed as GDM in a pregnant lady. So this criteria, you can just note a criteria like more than 2 hour postprandial glucose more than 200 can be considered a proper diabetes in pregnancy, and outside pregnancy also it is diabetes. Where if it is more than 140, it is a GDM, and if it's an outside pregnancy, it's called as impaired glucose tolerance. This is very important. The third part, 2 hour postprandial glucose more than 120 can be considered decreased gestational glucose tolerance, DGGT, in pregnant ladies. A single test procedure has been developed by the DIPSI, and this is the antenatal single test procedure is when a pregnant lady comes to your clinic, you give a 75 gram oral glucose load, whether she is fasting or non-fasting, and you collect the blood sugar at around 2 hours. And if it is more than 140 milligram per deciliter, your lady is having GDM. If this is another thing, if the 75 gram glucose packet is not available, from a 100 gram packet, you remove around 5 teaspoons of glucose, and your 75 gram glucose load is ready. So why this is why the rationality of the test is so like this, because most of this pregnant ladies won't be in a fasting state when they come to your clinic. So even after a meal, a normal glucose tolerant woman would be able to maintain euglycemia despite the glucose challenge due to the brisk and adequate insulin response. So this is more advantageous because this will eliminate the false positivity in the diagnosis of GDM. By following the usual recommendation for screening between the 24 and 28 weeks of gestation, there is actually a chance of detecting unrecognized type 2 diabetes before pregnancy is likely to be missed. So if the 2 hour postprandial glucose is more than 200 milligram per deciliter in the early weeks of pregnancy, the women may be having diabetes even before the pregnancy, and an A1C of more than 6.5 is confirmatory. So a pregnant woman found to have a normal glucose tolerance in the first trimester should be tested for GDM again in the 24 to 28 hour and also in the 32nd to 34th week. So this is OGTT and the diagnostic glycemic goals. It's already known to all of you. So the vast majority of the people are screened for, only around 90% of these people around the world are screened properly for GDM. Around 14% are only screened very less frequently. So diabetes and pregnancy, actually, there are two types. One is GDM and also a pregnancy, the diabetes complicating pregnancy. So what should be actually thought of or considered? Actually, in the pre-consumption period itself, management of the diabetic woman is a complex process which should begin before conception. In the pre-conception period, the insulin regimens can be modified to improve glycemic control. Cholesterol lowering medication should be discontinued. ACE inhibitors can be should be changed to a calcium channel blocker, and folic acid therapy can be instituted. To evaluate the risk in pregnancy, an eye evaluation can be performed, and genetic risk also can be addressed. Counseling specific risk and expectations also should be provided. So this is a simplified chart. You can see the optimal glycemic control, A1C of less than 7 or as close to 6 should be maintained. The medication should be actually verified because you have to discontinue statin, stop ACE inhibitors or ARBs. Nutrition counseling is very important. BP goal should be less than 140/90. And a retinal examination, nephropathy assessment should also be done in those people with diabetes entering pregnancy. Thyroid assessment is also very important because the TSH should be maintained less than 2.5. So in the first trimester, what should be actually done? Hospitalization may be required to reevaluate the diet and adjust the blood sugars accordingly. Education regarding the importance of the dietary intake and glycemic control to the health of the fetus. Hypoglycemia in pregnancy is common mostly in the first trimester. And lab studies to actually assess whether the patient will be a candidate to develop preeclampsia also should be thought of. So the lab investigations include LFTs, renal function test, HbA1c, 24-hour urine for protein and creatinine clearance. And also the nuchal translucency can be used for early screening for not only chromosomal problems but also to detect congenital heart disease. In the second trimester, the insulin requirements actually increase than the first trimester. You can do a targeted ultrasound for the congenital anomalies at 16 to 18 weeks and a fetal echo at around 20 to 22 weeks. And also subsequent ultrasound for the fetal growth should be monitored every 3 to 4 weeks. The other maternal screening can be helpful. Serum screening can be helpful in screening for the other fetal defects. In the third trimester, actually the insulin requirements may go up to 140% of the pre-pregnancy doses. For example, if your diabetic lady is taking an insulin of around 10 units before pregnancy, in the third trimester it may go up to 24 units. In women with hypertension and IUGR, testing can begin at 28 gestational weeks. The contraction stress test and the biophysical profile are generally used when the NSD is non-reactive. And the Doppler assessment of the umbilical artery can be done to assess the IUGR suspicion. And the cesarean should be reserved for other obstetric indications, fetal compromise, and if the fetal weight is more than 4.5 kilo. In the intrapartum, actually, tight glycemic control helps to decrease the neonatal hypoglycemia, and women should be instructed not to take their basal or a long-acting insulin when in the labor or the day prior to the labor, and to begin on insulin infusion. After delivery, the infusion can be discontinued, or if a cesarean delivery was needed and a full diet is not instituted, it can be continued, but the insulin dosage should be decreased. In the postpartum period, actually the insulin requirements decrease quickly and most of them can be weaned off the insulin. The insulin dosing can either be decreased by around 40 to 50% or can be changed to the pre-pregnancy doses. Women with diabetes who breastfeed have lower daily blood glucose levels and generally require less insulin. And breastfeeding may also have a protective effect against the development of type 1 diabetes in childhood. So this is a logistic algorithm which actually in your GDM patients, you start with a premix insulin around 4 units before breakfast. Every fourth day try to increase by around 2 units till around 10 units. And if the fasting glucose is even after this is more than 90 milligram per deciliter, advise 6 units around breakfast time and 4 units in the dinner time. And review with the blood sugar test and adjust further insulin dosage accordingly. Initially, if the post-breakfast plasma glucose is very high, you can start on a premix of 50-50 concentration. If the GDM is diagnosed in the third trimester, there is still chance that your patient can be off insulin still. So a medical nutrition therapy is actually advised. And if it fails, you can start on an insulin. If the 2-hour postprandial glucose is more than 200 at diagnosis, a starting dose of 8 units of premix insulin could be administered straight away. And then it can be titrated. So regarding the lifestyle management, actually the lifestyle management is very much important because the fasting glucose in your patient should be less than 95. The 1 hour postprandial should be less than 140 and 2 hour postprandial should be less than 120. So medical nutrition therapy has been proposed in a very important way nowadays. And the food plan should be based on a nutrition assessment with guidance from the dietary reference intake. Actually, the DRI for all pregnant women recommends a minimum of around 175 gram of carbohydrate, a minimum of 71 gram of protein, and a 28 gram of fiber. So, as it is true for all nutrition therapy in patients with diabetes, the amount and type of carbohydrate will impact the glucose level, especially the post-meal excursions. So, insulin is a first-line agent recommended for the treatment of GDM. This is regarding the pharmacotherapy, and insulin may be required to treat hyperglycemia, and it should follow the guidelines below. Both the multiple daily injections, that is the multiple injections or the subcutaneous insulin pump, are reasonable alternatives, and neither has been shown to be superior during pregnancy. So metformin, what about the metformin? Metformin was actually associated with a lower risk of neonatal hypoglycemia and less maternal weight gain than the other drugs in the 2015 reviews. And furthermore, nearly half of the patients with GDM who were initially treated with metformin needed insulin at a later stage. And umbilical cord levels of blood metformin are higher than the simultaneous maternal levels. So what about glyburide? Because some centers are using glyburide. In very difficult cases or very rare cases, you can use that. But still, the concentrations of glyburide in the umbilical cord plasma are approximately 70% of that of the maternal level. And actually, it is more associated with neonatal hypoglycemia and macrosomia than insulin or metformin. So insulin, you know that is confirmed that it is a preferred agent for management in both type 1 and type 2 diabetes because oral agents are insufficient to overcome the insulin resistance which is seen in pregnancy and diabetes. So what about preventing preeclampsia? So in most of your patients with diabetes, actually, in whatever type of diabetes, you start on a low dose aspirin between 60 to 150 milligram per day from the end of the first trimester to lower the risk of preeclampsia. In pregnant patients, you have to maintain a BP target of less than 130 or even 120. the systolic and less than 80 millimeter in the diastolic thing, and teratogenic medications like ACE inhibitors, ARBs, and statins should be avoided in even those even planning for pregnancy. These agents has to be stopped. So to summarize, the cost and standardization of glycated hemoglobin are major issues for consideration, because some centers are not even doing HbA1c in diagnosis or treating GDM. A large survey conducted all over India covering 24 states reveals that more than half of the diabetologists or endocrinologists and gynecologists in India do not follow any of the recommended guidelines. Even though the guidelines are a lot, they do not follow any of these guidelines. The A1C is not possible to perform in the less resource countries, not only because it is expensive, but also due to lack of technically qualified staff. So antenatal workup and antenatal care is very important in your diabetic patients. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sukesh. I think we'll move to the next speaker. I think the other faculty will be introducing the next speaker. Over to you, Shabir.
Without wasting much time, we will go on to the next topic. The next topic is exercise in pregnancy, which is a very important topic. To deal with this, we have an eminent speaker, Dr. Roy Chandran, who is an associate professor in the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation from the Government Medical College in Calicut. And he has many publications to his credit, around 12 original research papers in national and international medical journals. And he's a regular speaker in many national and regional forums. And he has received many awards as IMA National Award 2018 for the Best Local Branch President. So over to you, Dr. Roy Chandran.
Respected chairs and dear friends, the moment a child is born, the mother is also born. She never existed before, the woman existed, but the mother never. A mother is something absolutely new. It's a words by Guru Rajneesh. And you know that we need to, our mothers and children to be healthy. And one important intervention for the same is proper lifestyle. And this is again one important part in this management of several diseases, and also in the complications, to avoiding complications of pregnancy, and unfortunately again neglect. Pregnancy is one of the most divine things, and for some pregnancy is a disease, and some pregnancy is an opportunity, and for some pregnancy never prevents them from reaching their goals. Say this, in 2017 Australian Open, Serena Williams was a winner, but she was 8 weeks pregnant at that time. So there was an editor in The Guardian, Serena Williams' pregnancy victory reminds us how amazing women's bodies are. So we should protect the women bodies. We can avoid, there are so many problems with pregnancy and after pregnancy. Many of them can be prevented by proper lifestyle. Coming to my topic, this is a traditional advice during pregnancy for exercising women to reduce their habitual levels of exertion in pregnancy. For non-exercising women to refrain from initiating strenuous exercise program. This is based on the concept that exercise could affect the early and late pregnancy outcomes by increasing the core body temperature during embryogenesis, increasing the risk of congenital anomalies like neural tube defects, shifting oxygenated blood and energy substrate to the maternal skeletal muscle away from the developing fetus, leading to growth retardation, and risk of maternal musculoskeletal injury due to changes in posture and center of gravity, fetoplasmal injury due to blunt trauma or stress effects from sudden motions. So the research over years have shown that several of this have shown that in pregnancy, physical inactivity and excessive weight gain have been recognized as independent risk factor for maternal obesity and related pregnancy complications, including GDM. And these are the benefits: the higher incidence of what? Vaginal delivery, and lower incidence of excessive gestational weight gain, gestational diabetic mellitus, gestational hypertensive disorders, preterm birth, cesarean section, and higher birth weight will be less in active pregnant ladies. Also, other benefits like essential factor in the prevention of depressive disorders, very important thing in the postpartum period, decreased postpartum recovery time, and increased placental surface area. That means an effective placentation which can prevent the PIH. And moreover, consider the risk of not participating in exercise activities during pregnancy will cause loss of muscle and cardiovascular fitness, development of varicose vein, as well also DVT, higher incidence of physical complaints such as dyspnea and low back pain. In mothers with pre-gestational medical conditions like chronic hypertension type 1 or type 2 diabetes, prenatal exercise reduced cesarean section by 55% and did not increase the risk of adverse maternal and neonatal outcomes. See, coming to the examples of exercise that have been extensively studied in pregnancy and found to be safe and definitely beneficial, like walking, stationary cycle, not otherwise, stationary cycling, aerobics like Zumba and other dance forms, hydrotherapy, water aerobics, resistance exercise using weights, elastic bands, etc. There are a few contraindications to exercise in pregnancy. You know that? Absolute contraindications are ruptured membranes, preterm labor, hypertensive disorders of pregnancy which are uncontrolled, incompetent cervix, growth restricted fetus, triples and above, placenta previa after 28 weeks, persistent second or third trimester bleeding, uncontrolled type 1 diabetes and uncontrolled thyroid disorders, and the relative contraindication where aggressive exercise are contraindicated. We can do moderate intensity exercise like previous spontaneous abortion, previous preterm birth, mild moderate cardiovascular disorders, respiratory disorders, anemia of less than 10 gram, malnutrition, thin pregnancy after 28, etc. And the other question is when to start an exercise program. The best time, is it a second trimester? Some say that it is second trimester when the nausea, vomiting, and profound fatigue of the first trimester have passed and before the physical limitation of the third trimester begin, but ideally before conceiving. All women without contraindication should be encouraged to participate in aerobic and strength conditioning exercise as part of the healthy lifestyle before, during, and after pregnancy. There is, that is something called a Pharmadex for pregnancy for the women who are ready for exercise during pregnancy. Who have been exercising prior to pregnancy can continue their exercise if there is no contraindications. And previously sedentary should start with small exercise programs, low intensity like 15 minutes, continuous exercise 3 times a week, gradually increase to 30-minute sessions 4 to 5 times a week. Intensity, this is a classical thing I've presented in the last before noon session. This is the thing, 220 minus age, that should be a moderate intensity with 50 to 70% of maximum. But this won't be effective in pregnancy because there is an increase of 10 to 15 beats per minute in resting heart rate in pregnancy. After that, a maximal exercise level, there is a blunted heart rate. It won't be increased to higher level. So, and also in the first trimester, there is a vasodilatation, decrease in preload and tachycardia. The third, there will be expanded blood volume and increased stroke volume. So, these physiological changes will make it difficult to attain the heart rate were calculated with 220 minus age. So, again, you can use the TOWK test. The simple thing I have talked regarding this in the previous session. We should target it on moderate intensity in the TOWK test. That means you cannot sing, but you can talk, and it don't reach the vigorous level. You can use this one. So very important thing, the Box rating of perceived exertion. You should target between fairly light to hard. That means 12 to 14. An aerobic exercise or resistance exercise should be there. The most distinct changes during pregnancy, that as weight gain and shift of the point of gravity that results in progressive lordosis and LVA. More than 60% of all pregnant women experience low back pain and almost 50 to 70% thereafter. And strengthening an abdominal and back muscles could minimize the risk, can improve glycemic status, and can be used if aerobics are not tolerated, like walking is not tolerated in the third trimester. There's a simple exercise like pelvic tilt. These are bridging and anterior pelvic tilt. We can strengthen the core muscles. But the thing is, this can be used in the first trimester. Maintaining a supine position during exercise after 20 weeks of gestation may result in decreased venous return due to the compression of the vessels. You know that, leading to hypotension. So we should modify this exercise after 20 weeks of pregnancy, like sitting pelvic tilt or standing pelvic tilt, or knee to knee wrist position exercises, or sitting exercises, and kneeling exercise with back stretch, and also squats. And women should stop exercising when there is excessive shortness of breath, chest pain, pre-syncope, painful uterine contraction, leakage of amniotic fluid, and vaginal bleeding. And one exercise which is absolutely contraindicated is scuba dive, because the fetus is not protected from decompression sickness and gas embolism. And caution should be taken in horseback riding and cycling. Static cycling you can do, but gymnastic and cycling should be avoided or used with caution. And high altitude more than 2,500 meters. Coming to the GDM, you know that this during the second half of pregnancy, insulin sensitivity falls, and there's a demand of insulin increase, and the placenta may not be, the pancreas may not be give more and enough insulin, and that result in GDM. And C, avoid high intensity exercise after the first trimester. Definitely, even if you are very, very active, you should avoid high intensity after the first trimester. And the pre-pregnancy physical exercise can reduce the GDM risk by 55%. Regular physical activity in the early pregnancy was also associated with the reduction of risk, but not as pre-gravid stage. See, these are the improvements in exercise in GDM, improvement in insulin sensitivity, improves blood supply to the active skeletal muscles, decrease in insulin secretion, decrease maternal weight gain, normalize blood glucose, avoid fetal macrosomia. See, in GDM, better to avoid weight training. As you know that is weight training, not strengthening exercise. Weight training is an anaerobic exercise which uses glucose, and there is high chance of hypoglycemia. And I will stop my presentation by saying, see this by Jill Churchill. There is no way to be the perfect mother, but a million ways to be a good one. See, this is Serena Williams practicing with her 2.5-year-old daughter. Her name is Olympia. Both are healthy. And salutes, this is Lady Alicia Montana, who participated in 2014 US Indo Games. See, she was 34 weeks pregnant at that time. And this is my reference. Thank you very much, Dr. Shabir and team, for giving this opportunity. Thank you very much. Over to the judges.
Thank you, Dr. Roy, for an excellent presentation on exercise in pregnancy. So, the discussion will be at the end of the symposium. We'll straight away go to the next topic by Dr. Wasim. He is an upcoming, very promising, young, dynamic physician and diabetologist working in Kraft Hospital. And he has graduated from Government Medical College, Tanjavur, with a fellowship from CMC Vellore. And he has many publications in index journals. And his topic will be how to initiate and titrate insulin therapy in pregnancy. So over to Dr. Wasim Ahmed for the topic.
Thank you, Sabir sir and the team Diabetes Today for giving me this opportunity. Dr. Sukesh has almost touched upon insulin and the management during pregnancy. So I'll be discussing more about, what, why, where, when, and how, and in whom we have to start on insulin. So pregnancy is always special, but sometimes due to the impaired insulin sensitivity and the increase in the insulin resistance, there is surge in the plasma glucose levels, and which can lead to adverse pregnancy outcomes, which can in turn lead to maternal and fetal complications. We have to tackle the trio presentation, that is the subset of people who have increased glycemic surge during the pregnancy, that they can be already a diabetic patient or a person who is turned with gestational diabetes during pregnancy. There is something called target and range, which according to me, the new TIR, we are very familiar with the time and range, but in pregnancy, there is this target and range which needs to be tackled. The HbA1c cutoff, it's to be maintained less than 6 according to the recent guidelines as well, but this can be relaxed up to less than 7 in case of severe hypoglycemia. That is only at the cost of a severe hypoglycemia if a pregnant woman is suffering from. And the fasting plasma glucose should be less than 95, 1 hour less than 140, 2 hour less than 120. It's already well discussed. Below, you're seeing a graph where this is the GDM diabetes patient who was planning pregnancy, and the basic sugars are almost well maintained. So it's said that the average sugar levels should be maintained around 105 to 110 for good results. So all the guidelines or all the organizations give the same cutoff 95, 140, 120, and most women do well with only lifestyle interventions. And the pharmacotherapy, be it insulin or OADs, can be started once the glycemic control is inadequate with MNT. So the ADA and the NICE as well as stick on to the same guidelines, but NICE in a good way also points out that in case we find out a fetal macrosomia happening around, then there is a need to start on insulin. Probably it could be because of the unidentified glycemic excursions, hypoglycemic therapy. India is closely related to PPG because our food is most rich in carbs. So as you see, the postprandial glycemic surge happens almost half an hour to 1 hour later of the food consumption. So the insulin is definitely needed to control this glycemic surge. Although we take into consideration the 2 hour cutoff according to the Indian guidelines, but the international guidelines also say the 1 hour cutoff. So the prime reason behind this 1 hour cutoff and the 2 hour cutoff is that it definitely makes sense that both 1 hour and the 2 hour cutoff should be normal or within that range, that is less than 140 and less than 120. There is no point having a 1 hour postprandial values around 200 and a 2 hour postprandial value around 120. So it definitely makes sense that even the 1 hour cutoff should be made less than 140. Suppose we target the 1 hour cutoff to be less than 140, then definitely in most of the times the 2 hour cutoff is well below 120 according to my clinical experience. And this is the insulin secretion, the physiological secretion which happens. We have a bolus and a basal phase which is happening. This is the same type of insulins we have in the market as well in the artificial forms. The bolus has 2 peaks as you see, and the rest is with the help of the basal, that the sugars, the intermeal sugars are maintained in the normal insulin, insulin aspart, lispro, glulisine, which are all the rapid acting insulins. Then the detamag, degludec, and glargine, which are long acting, and the NPH, which is an intermediate one. And the ones I have marked in the red, circled in the red, they don't have much of clinical data. Whereas glargine at present has some good studies upcoming with safety data available, and degludec is also under trials to be used in pregnancy. So let's look into the action profile of all these insulins. You see the effect starts very early when compared to the short or the regular acting one. That is the usual atrapid used earlier days. And the rapid acting, it starts very early and it gives a very good short acting as well when compared to the usual regular insulins. If you see, the regular insulin lasts for almost, say, the effect if you start the regular insulin, the effect of it's almost lasts about 8 hours. But it's not so with the rapid acting. It starts soon, sets off the postprandial excursions, and then comes back soon to the normal. So the NPH or the intermediate one, it usually peaks around between 6 to 8 hours or 8 to 10 hours usually, and then it waves off around 12 to 14 hours. The long-acting and the long-acting detamag, glargine, and degludec usually have a kind of almost a flat profile, with degludec having a very flat profile. As you see, the rapid-acting insulins have a better PPG control and have a low risk of delayed hypoglycemia, which can happen with the regular insulins. And say the glargine and as well as the degludec, they have a good 24-hour post fasting or a pre-meal coverage and have a low risk of hypoglycemia when compared to NPH. Last, but it's fast. This is one of the fastest insulin which is available. You see, the pancreas secretes in this way, and the regular insulin secretes in this way. acts in this way. And the rapid acting, which we discussed, the Lispro, Aspart, and the Glulysin, they act in this way. But the one in the orange, it is called the insulin Fiasp, which is recently available in the market in the last 2-3 years. And it has a good, fast, quick onset of action. And it also gives us an advantage of timing the insulin even after the meals. Say 10 minutes after the meals is also fine. But when we start the regular insulin, we need to space it around 30 minutes before the meals. But with the fast-acting, ultra-fast-acting Fiasp, we can place it just soon after the meals as well. This is the list of insulins which are available. The ones marked in red belong to the C category, although FDA after 2015 has said that this labeling is not needed. But still, degludec and glargine are not to be used in because of medical legal issues, because they are not recommended. They don't come under the CADP. Basal insulin in pre-existing diabetes women. So we usually switch over people who are on glargine or degludec to NPH or detamar during pregnancy. But glargine has shown us some safe and successful pregnancies. Even in my practice, I have used in almost quite a good number of patients, and they appear to be relatively safe. No fetal problems or any kind of anomalies or maternal complications have occurred so far. And the glargine and the degludec are unlikely to cross the placenta, and they don't have a compelling evidence to switch over to NPH. But there is no evidence as such for detamar. In case you have hypoglycemic episodes, even with that, or you feel that the number of pricks are too much for the women, then you can use glargine if the patient is also accepting it equally. The RSSDI ESI consensus also say the same, that the rapid acting insulins are very much effective and safe during pregnancy. And they also mentioned that there is no safety or efficacy data available on the use of glargine, glulysin, and even detamar in pregnancy is what they say. According to almost all the guidelines, our experience is almost the same as the evidence. We all know that the rapid acting insulin gives very good results in controlling the postprandial sugars, and the NPH and the detamar can be well used as basal insulins. And the regular insulins, the newer human insulins, are very less immunogenic and can be safely used during the pregnancy. This is the typical insulin requirement which we have been reading from the UG days. The first trimester requirement around 0.7 units per kg, second 0.8, third 0.9, term 1. And in extremely obese lady, the requirements can go even up to 2 units per kg. But this requirement is something which we need to think about. Let's go deep into the requirement. Say during the first initial period, there is an increase in the insulin resistance. And because of that, the insulin requirement is high. Later on, between 10 to 16 weeks, the insulin resistance drops up. There is also an increase in the insulin resistance and the insulin requirement. And at the term, it almost plateaus off, even to half of the pre-pregnancy values. One thing which we need to notice in this is that between the 10 and 16 weeks, if we have a patient who's already on insulin, make sure that you have an eye over this patient, because this patient can land up into hypoglycemia at any moment, and we need to adjust or titrate the doses or reduce the doses accordingly. It is said that after 16 weeks, for every week of pregnancy, there is a 5% increase in the insulin dose which is required. And the insulin regimens for hyperglycemia in pregnancy, there are two options which we can take: either a weight-based dosing or a trimester and a weight-based dosing. The weight-based dosing is from 0.7 to 1 units per kg per day into divided doses, and the trimester or a weight-based dosing, it's what I already discussed. If you take this into consideration, 2/3 of the total daily dose can be given in the morning and 1/3 in the evening. Out of the 2/3 in the morning, you divide it into 1/3 into a rapid acting, 2/3 into an NPH. Really complicated. Let's work it out in a case scenario. Or there is also a 1 dose for all regimen, NPH 20 and 20 in the night, 20 in the morning and 20 in the night, and rapid acting insulin 10 in the morning and 10 in the night. This is something flow chart. As you see, the 0.7 to 1 units per kg we already discussed, and 0.7, 0.8, 0.9. You calculate the basal dose, and the remaining 50% divided between the 3 meals as short or rapid acting insulins. This is the another way of representing the same. You give a 50% of the basal insulin at bedtime, and you monitor the fasting sugar levels. If it's still high, then we'll have to increase the basal insulin by about 2 to 4 units. And we give the 50% basal divided into 3 meals, and we monitor the 1 hour, 2 hour sugars. And if it's well within cutoff, fine. If it's more, then we'll have to increase the dose by 2 to 4 units as well. Taking all these guidelines into consideration, let's work it out on a case. A 27-week primee, 60 kg weight.
Sorry
on
to
medical nutrition
interrupt.
therapy.
Please make it fast, doctor. But 2 or 3 minutes left.
And tablet metformin TID. Suppose we are going to take this lady into consideration, we'll have 48 units per day. And this is actually a very huge requirement and may not be necessary for this lady. So a fasting plasma glucose of greater than 110, we can start basal or intermediate acting insulin. PPG, if it's uncontrolled, you can start with a bolus insulin of 4 units. And if basal bolus is not convenient for the patient, you can always change it to a premix regimen. There are conditions where situations where people come, they don't accept for insulin, but you have to consider insulin when the postprandial surge is greater than 200. Definitely, if it's between 160 to 200 in the first and second trimester, try for MNT for 1 week and initiate insulin accordingly. And in the third trimester, if there is greater than 160, then you have to start insulin immediately. There is no conclusive evidence for the threshold value at which clinicians should start the medical therapy. And it's basically pure logic where how we have to titrate between the pre-meal and the post-meal sugars. We have to titrate this accordingly. You can take a screenshot of that, and in case you have any doubt, you can just contact me, because the fasting pre-lunch and the pre-dinner all work well with the intermediate and the basal insulins. The post-breakfast, post-lunch, and post-dinner are controlled well with the short or the rapid-acting insulins. So the Indian government has already given us a flow chart of how to titrate and monitor the sugar levels. For want of time, I'm just skipping this slide. The technique during pregnancy is also almost same. There is no change in the insulin site. Lateral parts of the abdomen can be used safely. During the third trimester, when the abdomen is very much distended, the skin fold can be raised a little bit for proper injection. So antenatal steroids and insulin, these are situations where the pregnant lady almost escape, but sometimes they have to take insulin. Particularly in type 1, we have to start on insulin infusion. And when it comes to type 2 or GDM, during the day 1, the requirement almost increases about 25%. Day 2, it's almost 40 to 50%. Day 3 is the same. After day 4, it almost tapers off. The intrapartum management is also equally important. The latent phase of labor, the requirement of insulin is usually stable, but in the early phase, it's not that much. And we need to avoid the maternal hyperglycemia in want of to reduce the neonatal hypoglycemia and the fetal acidosis. This is actually a chart which you can just take a screenshot. Can be used in your day-to-day practice. The mom returns back to normal. You can always reduce the dose to 0.5 units per kg per day. And this is something which I wanted to discuss in want of time. I'm just skipping it. The good clinical practice always involves taking into consideration the socio-cultural background. And there are few situations where people can be allowed to take cheat meals as well. And between the multi-dose insulin and the continuous subcutaneous insulin infusion, there is not much of difference. And we should take a shared decision making with the patient, and a personalized precision medicine is the need of the hour. Thank you very much for the opportunity given.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wasim, for an exhaustive presentation on insulin therapy. So, going to the next topic, I invite Dr. Purvi Chawla, who is a consultant diabetologist and a clinical researcher at Dinar Diabetes Research Center and Mumbai Diabetes Research Center. She is also an honorary consultant diabetologist at Bharatiya Arogya Raji Hospital, Mumbai.
Hello.
She was the organizing secretary for Women and Diabetes 2020 and organizing committee Challenges in Diabetes 2018, 2019 and 2020. And she is a trainer for several courses like NDEP and courses for dietitians and nutritional experts. So the topic is role of OHAs in diabetes in pregnancy. Over to you, doctor.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Can I share the slides? Thank you, Dr. Sabir, for this lovely invitation. The speakers were fantastic before this, and I've enjoyed every single presentation. Although the camera was off, I was listening and following everything. So, just a short prayer for all the victims last evening and their loved ones who have to bear this tragedy. And with that, we go on to the main topic. So with all these, 6 lectures before me, I think any degree of glucose or carbohydrate intolerance with onset and first recognition during present pregnancy as endorsed by IADPSG and DIPSI as well since 2014 is no surprise to this august audience. The IDF 2019 Atlas said that 16% of prevalence of hyperglycemia in pregnancy existed, impacting about almost 20 million live births, and 84% were attributed to GDM. So that's a huge number we are dealing with. India too is no less. The prevalence is anywhere between 4 to 21%. As you can see, across the states, it's slightly different, with the highest prevalence in South India. And this prevalence is also expected to increase by 15%, reaching the final figures to almost 80 million by 2030. So that's a huge number we are talking about. Asians with their predisposition to type 2 diabetes, this is definitely something that should be alerting each one of us focused on diabetes care. Again, this audience already is well informed about the transgenerational risk. Diabetes begets diabetes, and it's beautifully shown here in this diagram. I will not belabor much on this point because I think it's made well throughout all the presentations. With this, we urge everybody to improve the pregnancy outcomes. And again, lot has been talked about how we improve the pre-pregnancy care, and I will not deliberate on that. But for pregnancy outcomes, we need to control the glycemia better and improve the time in range. Again, continuous glucose monitoring is also going to improve the outcomes. Diet, exercise, limit weight gain is the mantra for pregnancies. With that, I think medical nutrition therapy controls almost 70 to 80% of GDM. The role of metformin has changed gears a bit in the last few years, and we'll see how in the subsequent slides. And insulin is definitely the mantra again, and it was beautifully described. The technique, the different types of insulin, everything was described very well in the previous presentation by Dr. Wasim. So with that, I want you to focus on metformin. Metformin is nothing but a biguanide derivative from the Galega officinalis plant, which the picture of which I have put here in the slide. We have over 65 years of metformin use experience with us. And this is a drug that gets highly concentrated in the small intestine, liver, and kidneys. It is positively charged, concentrates again in the mitochondrial level up to 1,000 folds due to the organic, the cation transporters. The remainder is excreted in feces with no active metabolites. So this is the drug we are talking about. Besides the primary action in the liver, where it suppresses gluconeogenesis through the AMPK pathway, it has pleiotropic effects on multiple tissues, including anti-cancer effects, the change in gene expression, positive microbiome effects, and anti-inflammation. So metformin is a wonder drug. And let's see how its use has been promoted in pregnancy. And then, there was a sudden break. And let's see the data or the scientific evidence we have so far. So the MIG trial, or metformin in gestational diabetes study, one of the largest randomized controlled trials of metformin in GDM, where 751 women with GDM were randomized between 20 to 33 weeks of gestation to either receive metformin with or without supplemental insulin or insulin alone. The primary outcome in this trial was a composite of neonatal hypoglycemia, respiratory distress, the APGAR scoring, birth trauma, need for phototherapy, or premature baby. The secondary outcomes were also markers of neonatal and maternal health. And what did we find? This is the primary MIG trial result conclusion published in 2008 that amongst these women, which had almost 46% Caucasians and the rest Polynesians, Asians, and even Indians in the study, they found that almost 46 or 50% in the metformin arm failed therapy or did not reach glycemic targets and required supplemental insulin. And the overall conclusion was that in women with GDM, metformin alone or with insulin is not associated with increased perinatal complications as compared to insulin. And women globally preferred metformin to insulin therapy. This is no surprise. So this was in 2008, and since then, everybody was using metformin and even glyburide for GDM, for managing, controlling glycemia during GDM. Now, in 2017, there was a sudden break on this trend of metformin use by ACOG, where ACOG is the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and they suddenly brought insulin much higher up, and they said insulin was the choice of agent. And the ADA also took a similar stand, saying insulin was the preferred choice of GDM management. The next year, the following year, they softened their stand a bit because there was a lot of protest from the obstetricians or some sort of resistance because simply because insulin is not cheap and not very easy to use or convince the patient to take it. Hence, they withdrew that stand and then they softened it, saying that metformin or glyburide could be a reasonable alternative choice, and we need to explain to the patients the lack of long-term safety data and also the fact that some of them may proceed to receive insulin in future. The Society for Maternal and Fetal Medicine in the same year stated, in fact, they brought up metformin a bit and they said that metformin is reasonable and safe first-line pharmacological alternative to insulin, recognizing that half will still require insulin. So there was a sudden shift again in 2018. And let's see what the data was and why did they suddenly say so. So this is the MIG tofu trial, which is nothing but the long-term follow-up of the original MIG trial, which I showed you the results of, published in 2008. This was almost 10 years later, 2018. It was released, and this was the body composition and anthropometric outcomes of at 7 to 9 years of age in the offspring. So while the original trial was analyzed as a single or a total cohort, they decided to analyze the offspring data in terms of two separate cohorts. One was from the Adelaide side and one was from the Auckland side. And the Adelaide one, they found that there was less insulin use, but there was increased LGA or large for gestational age found in the metformin arm versus insulin. At 7 years, there were no differences found. Similarly, in the Auckland cohort, they found that there was more insulin use, but there was no difference in LGA found. And at 2 and 7 and 9 years of age of the offspring, they found increased anthropometric measurements and increased body fat as seen by MRI. So this was the turn that suddenly brought the long-term fetal effects of metformin to light. Another study, a very important study released last year by Lancet Child and Adolescent Health in March 2019, the PEDMED study, which was nothing but the 5 to 10 year follow-up of the original PREGMED study, found that in 141 children who consented to participate, they found that children in the metformin group had higher BMI scores, significantly higher waist circumference and also weight in the metformin arm rather than the control arm. So this was again some more corroborative data to the MIG tofu results. This is nothing but the follow-up of two randomized controlled trials that evaluated metformin in PCOS pregnancies and the outcome at 4 years of age in the offspring. They
Again,
found a
sorry to interrupt,
2.2.
ma'am. Please make it fast. 2 or 3 minutes.
I'll need 5 minutes more.
Only
2.2
2 or
times
3 minutes. Please make it fast.
increased overweight obese at 4 years, and this trend almost started at 6 months of age. So in 2019, this wonderful review by Dr. Barber and Frege, they concluded that metformin does not prevent GDM and modestly lowers glucose. And they also reflected that if there was an inability to adapt to postnatal environment with nutrient excess in infants exposed to metformin. Another review also sang the same song. They questioned the long-term effects of metformin, and they said that we need further studies to look into that. So again, in terms of, and this is the latest paper, 2020, in May itself, they compared various pharmacological agents and they did a systematic review and meta-analysis of the effect in GDM, and they found that long-term data was required. So what did we do? The ADA Standards of Care 2020 clearly endorsed they clearly endorsed insulin, but said that in case insulin is not being able to use, then metformin is a good alternative to that with some exceptions. And they said in case of PCOS pregnancies, metformin should be discontinued at the end of the first trimester. In terms of several other guidelines world over, again, they all have said the same thing, that women who are non-adherent to or refuse insulin, glyburide, or metformin may be used as effective agents. In fact, there are Indian authors also who reflected on all this data, and they said that maybe it could be considered in milder forms of GDM where glycemic goals were not attained by lifestyle changes. So we are awaiting two major trials, MIGHTY and MIGHTY Kids, which will throw some further light on that. With respect to glyburide or glibenclamide, again, a major trial was reported, and they found that they concluded that in women with GDM, glyburide is a clinically effective alternative to insulin therapy. But because there is a lot of conflicting data or controversial data from different studies, the overall conclusion is that long-term follow-up data of children exposed to glyburide in utero to establish the long-term safety is required. Alpha glucosidase inhibitor, acarbose, has also been studied, and there are some encouraging reviews, but none of the guidelines endorse that. So with that, I come to the Indian guidelines, and what do they say? That metformin or insulin therapy is the accepted medical management of pregnant women with GDM not controlled on medical nutrition therapy. Insulin may be started at any time. However, in pregnant women with GDM before 20 weeks, if MNT fails, then insulin should be started, but metformin may be used at 20 weeks of pregnancy if MNT has failed to control the blood sugars. Metformin in the dose of 500 milligrams twice daily orally up to a maximum of 2 grams per day is again endorsed by them. And if blood sugars are still not controlled with the maximum dose of metformin and medical nutrition therapy, insulin to be added. They also reflect that hypoglycemia and weight gain with metformin are less in comparison to insulin. And if insulin is required in high doses, again, metformin may be added. This is our homegrown Indian guidelines, which endorsed by DIPSI as well. So my take-home message for today is that GDM management for several reasons is extremely important. Pharmacotherapy is required if medical nutrition therapy fails to achieve our glycemic targets. Insulin is the choice for GDM. Metformin is truly a multitasking oral anti-diabetic agent with several pleiotropic effects. Even though metformin is not teratogenic, insufficient evidence to continue metformin after conception in patients of PCOS is present, and definitely best avoided in placental insufficiency. Thus, metabolic agents that cross placenta with multiple mechanistic actions have to be used very cautiously. because fetal programming in utero is an important consideration guiding our choices to control maternal hyperglycemia. Thus, the best suggestion would be to follow local guidelines and look out for important trials outcomes data. So metformin may be used wherever it is not possible to initiate insulin after 20 weeks, but with adequate caution. Thank you so much for a patient hearing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Purvi. It was an excellent presentation. I think you have covered almost all the aspects of OHA usage in pregnancy. So the floor is open for discussion. One or two questions. So one question to Dr. Purvi. If a lady around 25 years come with a already a diabetic, she is a type 2 diabetic, and she is already taking on a sulfonylurea like glimepiride, and her HbA1c at the first visit itself is 7.8 or something. What will you advise? Will you advise her to continue it or change over to insulin?
Okay, so again, I think this is a very important topic where continuing or discontinuing drugs in case of type 2 diabetic patients who get pregnant, and we commonly refer to this as pre-GDM. My take on this is that I would discontinue the glimepiride and switch the patient on to insulin. We don't have adequate data with glimepiride. There may be anecdotal evidence. Several experts may say that it's completely safe if you use it well, but our guidelines currently don't say that. So, and there are these two big trials that are underway, which have been specifically designed to look at the continuation of metformin or glimepiride in patients of type 2 diabetes who get pregnant. So we'll wait for those outcome trials also to be reported. But until then, I think I would switch to insulin for sure.
Thank you, ma'am.
And of course, medical nutrition therapy, because half the battle can be won there itself.
For the want of time, I think we can close the session if there are no more questions. And thank you, Dr. Sabir, and all the organizers for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Sabir and team.